What is up my people, and welcome back to Technological Journey episode 6. In the last episode we set up biodiesel power infrastructure to switch away from the steam power that we previously had. We also got our first electronic circuits after also setting up some applied logistics interface automation at a basic level. In today's episode we're going to get our first refined circuits, we're going to get stainless steel, we're going to finally build the gold line, and we're also going to move all of our storage into a centralised location and integrate our AE2 system much better throughout the base, using storage buses and things of that nature. That will give us a lot of progression through the quest book as we enter the HV chapter, and it'll also mean we need to expand the base quite a bit. So, in terms of progression since the last episode, I've done very minimal crafting and very minimal machine work, but I have done an awful lot of building. So the only thing that I crafted up was this liquid fuel jetpack, which we talked about in I think it was episode 3 or 4. This is a relatively simple craft, and now we have our MB assembler over there, we could just chuck the pieces in and it would give it back to us. Now this thing runs off of biodiesel, which we will also obviously set up last episode, and it has two flight modes. It has this sort of explosive flight mode. Then if I press M at the same time as space, which is my custom keybind, it might be different for you, it gives us a hover mode. This is as close as to creative flight as we're going to get for a significant portion of time in this pack, so it's quite nice to have. The next thing I did was I've done a significant amount of building. I've added an entire new floor to the base through that wall there. Now I'm aware that not everybody enjoys watching building time lapses, so if you just want to skip to the quick walkthrough, I'm going to put a timestamp on the screen now. But if watching me build is your thing, then I'm just going to put in a little montage of the progression we made. Okay, so the first room that I showed in the time lapse was the construction of this room here, which is going to be our new centralised storage area. This is going to have space for our storage crates, which we can hook up to the applied logistics system, and I'll talk about how we're going to do that in a second. Over this side we're going to have the same thing as this, but for fluid tanks. So this will be our centralised fluid storage for all of our key fluids. And then under here, under these stairs and this bridge, I've got a little space here where we're going to put our ME drives. Now we're not going to need to fill this up just yet because we don't need a lot of drives at this point, but that should be able to accommodate all of our drives until the end of the game. And that, even though it's not a lot of space, that should still be enough, just because in this pack I believe that there are extra storage cells. Yeah, so you can see here 16,384k storage component. So I don't know how many drives there are here, maybe like 16 to 32. 32 of those is going to be plenty to supply us right until the end of the pack. Now the next thing that I built was I built this corridor here. Now this is just in the centre of this walkway here, opposite our little bit that we've been working on so far. And if we go down here, you can see that we've got two exits. So this one here I built in, and I'll go down in a second. But this one here, I'm currently thinking we're going to use this as a walkway down to a room where we're going to put our nuclear processing later on in the game, which I think we unlock, wrong button, sorry, which I think we start to unlock and have to deal with in EV, EV here, all these nuclear processes we'll look at in a bit. But if we go down through here, we enter our chemistry room. Now, the reason I've left this room unfinished, unlike every other room I've built so far, is because this room, one, I'm not entirely sure how big I want it to be in the end, and two, because it's going to be the biggest room in the base, and we're most likely going to expand in all three directions, 1, 2 and 3. And the reason for that is because chemistry lines is the main focus of this pack, whether it be for producing different ores and ingots, or whether it be for producing fuel or power or things like that. Everything in this pack needs a chemical line. And once we get soundly into EV, we start to unlock these large multi-blocks. Now, there's obviously not space in this room at the moment for those large multi-block chemical lines, because they can take up a huge amount of space. But I'm thinking of expanding the room this way. And this space that we've got down here at the moment is going to be for our single block processing lines. Now, these are quite long, and when I say long, I mean because we're going to sort of encase our single block machines like we've done here, only instead of the crates and the conduits, it will just be the things needed for a processing line. But as I mentioned, they're quite long, and processing lines aren't necessarily going to be this long at the start of the game when we're using single block machines, but that's fine. We can fit multiple lines in each one of these sort of segments here. So that's you all caught up on the progress I've made in between episodes. Now, the first thing we're going to do today is we're going to hook up these storage drawers in this segment here to our applied logistics system. Now, with this hooked up to our applied logistics system, we just can access all of the items which I put in any of these drawers at any time, both for input and output. I've just moved over some of the things which we're storing in bulk, or will be storing in bulk, such as the tiles, cobblestone, iron, things like that, and then just a couple of dusts here which we're not using yet, so they're kind of stacking up in the system. And that allowed us to just empty our crate here on our steam oven, which was backed up seriously before. And now the next thing that we're going to do so that we can get it cooking up while we're working on other things throughout the episode is I'm going to batch up some stainless steel. Now, stainless steel is just made through stainless steel dust in a blast furnace at MV, so we can just repurpose our silicon ball blast furnace, which currently isn't running. And for that, we need iron dust, which is easily enough to get, we just need iron. Nickel dust, again easy to get, we just need nickel. Manganese dust and chrome dust. Now, these two come through ore processing, which I think I talked a little bit about when I made a single stainless steel a couple of episodes ago. But manganese we're just going to get through ore processing pyrolusite and the other ores that you find within a pyrolusite vein. And chrome we're going to get through ore processing ruby, both of which aren't particularly complex. It's just manually putting them through a couple of machines like the crusher a couple of times and then the centrifuge. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I've crafted 9 stacks of stainless steel dust. Probably a little bit overkill just to enter HV, but I mean we're going to need it all throughout, so it's not too bad. And now I'll just chuck this on the input hatch of our second EBF. The first one we're just smelting up some more aluminium dust that we got through the chrome processing. And then when this recipe's done, we will get some stainless steel. So that can just run in the background while we work on the next thing that we're going to do. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to finally build the gold line. Now, I know I said I'll do this last episode at the start, but we never actually got around to it because we sort of got delayed by our electronic circuit progression. But now we have the chemistry room, we can actually set this up. So if we go downstairs and just take a look where we want to do this. So I think I'm just going to set it up in this bit here. Obviously we're going to need to bring down our applied logistics cables and everything. Wiring shouldn't be too difficult because we do have some space behind this wall here which we can go down and underneath. And once we've hooked that all up, we should be able to use interfaces to transport our fluids and everything down here rather than have to use ender chests to do that, which is what I meant when I said we're going to integrate our AE2 system better throughout the base. So for the gold line, there are a few prerequisite chemicals that we need. We need oxygen, chlorine and nitrogen. I wanted to set this up in a reasonably permanent way because now we have the centralized fluid storage, we can do that. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to produce oxygen, and hydrogen will also happen as well, through the sodium hydroxide loop, which is this quest up here in the MV tab. And it produces hydrogen oxygen at 2 times the rate that we were previously making hydrogen oxygen using that little setup on site. chlorine for now we're just going to get through electrolyzing salt, and then nitrogen we're going to get through an air collector and centrifuging the air to give us nitrogen. All three of those chemicals are going to be set up over here, and then they're going to be imported up into the super tanks, which I've set up here in our centralized storage room. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to input the chemicals into this tank from the setups that I talked about a second ago. Using a storage bus as well, we'll be able to extract from these using applied logistics interfaces, as it will now be part of our system. And that means that we can extract directly where we need into the gold line. So I've gone ahead and I've set up the three chemicals that we needed here. So we've got first off nitrogen production, which is just being produced through centrifuging air here, which is being collected in this air collector, and that gives us nitrogen, and I think it's also 1 bucket of oxygen. Up here we have the sodium hydroxide loop, which mixes water and sodium to make sodium hydroxide, which then goes into this advanced electrolyzer, which makes us oxygen and hydrogen, as well as sodium, which gets put back into this, so it's just an infinite loop. The only thing it takes is water, which we're supplying here to this end of one. And then in terms of chlorine, I've just got an electrolyzer here electrolyzing salt for 1 bucket of chlorine per piece of salt. The salt's being input from this interface here, and I've got a machine controller on the side here with a level emitter turning off the machine once we reach 30 buckets of chlorine in our centralized fluid storage. Now all of these fluids are being input into this fluid interface, which is sending them up into this storage here, where we've got a super tank full of nitrogen, full of hydrogen, full of oxygen, and full of chlorine. Now I wasn't entirely sure the best way to do this, so what I've done is I've just put storage buses on the bottom, and these 4 tanks here are partitioned to their respective fluid. I've also set each of these tanks to priority 100, which means it will get input into these tanks before it gets input anywhere else in the base. And then, because some of the loops that I've got down there, for example the sodium hydroxide loop, produce 2 different chemicals at different amounts of chemical per cycle. So for example, I'm not sure if this is exactly the numbers, but say we get 3 buckets of oxygen and 2 buckets of hydrogen. That means that we're going to fill up the oxygen tank before we fill up the hydrogen tank. And I don't want hydrogen to stop producing just because we're full of oxygen. So what I've done is I put a storage bus on this fluid trash can, and I've set it partition to all 4 of the chemicals, and I've set it to -1000 priority. So what that essentially is going to do is when one of these tanks gets full, rather than stopping the entire production down there, it's just going to void any excess and keep filling up. Although I feel like that could be a bit of an issue, because it means that that loop is constantly running even when it's not necessarily producing any fluids. So it's constantly going to be draining power and just voiding the fluids at a certain point. So I'm not sure if there's a better way to do that. So if you know any better ways, please do let me know. But now we've got the chemicals that we need to start the gold line. I've also crafted up these machines here, which should be everything we need for the gold line, excluding all the wires and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up down here, and I'll bring all the wires over in a bit. So on screen now, we have the gold line loop, or like a flow chart for the gold line loop. So if you look on the bottom right there, you can see gold dust. So that is essentially what we're aiming to get, and we should get 2 gold dust as an output per every single precious metal input that we get, or that we give the system, sorry. So working from right to left going backwards, we need to set up a chemical reactor to produce our gold dust, and then going into that chemical reactor we're going to produce chloroauric acid from another chemical reactor, and it's also going to use potassium metabisulfate dust. Now that is a catalyst in the recipe, meaning it's not consumed, so we only need to make that once. I'm going to go ahead and do that in the mixer upstairs in a second. But to produce the chloroauric acid that we need, we're going to use another chemical reactor producing gold leach, and another chemical reactor producing hydrochloric acid. Now the chlorine for the hydrochloric acid is looped from the final chemical reactor that produces us gold dust, and the gold alloy ingot to make the gold leach is produced in an alloy smelter with 3 copper dust and a precious metal. The copper dust for the alloy smelter is produced in a chemical dehydrator, which used leached copper, which is a byproduct of the chemical reactor recipe that produces us chloroauric acid. So essentially this entire process loops around, including the chlorine in the system. So the only things that we need to input are precious metal, oxygen, and hydrogen. Okay, so I've gone ahead and I've set up all of the machines here that we need, and the interfaces and everything, and just hooked up with item filters and fluid filters all of the wiring. So I've tested it with the few precious metal that we had in our system. We only had like 5. But the way I've set this up is that the precious metal is just automatically input from our system because we don't use it for anything else, and it turns it into gold dust and just chucks it back into the system. I also crafted up this potassium metabisulfate dust, which is the catalyst in the final reactor. In terms of the other things we needed to jumpstart the system, I just needed to put in some nitrogen. The oxygen and the hydrogen came from here, and I also just need to put in some water. Now this trash can here I've got on low priority, which means if it can input into another place in the loop, then it will do that before it inputs into here. And I've just set this with a filter for water. This might not be correct, but it's just to be safe, because I think that we were producing excess water than what was looped in the system, or what was needed for the loop, and it was clogging up this reactor here, so I just put a trash can there. But the next step in order to get a bunch of gold is to go out and get some precious metal. Now, up until this point in the game, I've just been mining by hand using this efficiency 15 hammer, which we got right from the start, which is very fast to be honest, and it's not too much of an issue. But I think it's about time we upgrade the way that we mine. And because we have the time in the bottle, we can do that in a very efficient way, like extremely fast I'm talking about, using the chunk miner block. Now this goes from LV to HV in the single block form, and the only things that are different is it speeds up and uses more energy and drilling fluid. Although because we're going to be using time in a bottle, we're just going to go for the LV one because it doesn't really change much, because you'll see what I mean when I say it's fast when we actually set it up. So I'm just going to go ahead and craft this. It's not too hard, just some LV components. The only thing we haven't made so far is a diamond grinding head, which is literally just diamond dust, plates and diamond, so that's really not too difficult. So now that we've got the basic chunk miner, we are almost ready to go ahead and use it. But in order to run this thing, we need something called drilling fluid. Now this really isn't too hard to get. It's some stone dust, some water and some lubricant. And lubricant I believe we can just make with redstone and oil. We can even use creosote oil. But I'm actually going to use oil just because if you remember back in episode 2 I think it was, we set up an ender tank full of oil back in the mining dimension. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab that tank and use some of that oil to make our lubricant and our drilling fluid. Right, so in my hotbar here, I should have everything we need to do this. Now this LV solar panel here we got from the quest when we got the oil drilling rig. So if we just go outside and find a precious metal vein with our prospector, obviously this works for any ore vein that you want, but I want to do it with precious metal at the moment because that's what we're going to be turning into gold. So it looks like I found one here, as you can see. So you want to stand in the middle of this because this thing only mines a one chunk area. So if I just go ahead and I stand in the middle of this precious metal vein, which probably will be this chunk here. Yeah, here we go. So we're right in the center of our precious metal vein. Now if we go down onto the ground, and I've just realized it needs to be daytime for us to do this because we're using a solar panel. So I'm going to set this up and then I'm going to go back to base, sleep and come back. But in order to set this thing up, we want our chunk miner. We want to wrench it like this and then place a crate. Now this is where our ores are all going to be output. And then what you want to do is you want to get our drum full of drilling fluid and we want to put it in to here so you can see it's full. I'm going to put this back up here because it can only store 16 at once. And then we've got our solar panel, which once I've gone to sleep I'm going to put at the top. Now obviously we need to make sure this has access to the sun, so I'm just going to go ahead and destroy a bit of this tree. And now if we put the solar panel on top, it should start to get power. And as you can see it's consuming drilling fluid. And now what this is going to do is it's going to go through this chunk, and when it gets to the ores it's going to pick them up and put them in this chest here. So what we can do now with our time in a bottle is we can speed this up. And now this will just basically mean that it runs through the chunk at an extreme speed, and it should, as soon as it gets down to the level, start to pop out all of the ores. Yeah, here we go. So you can see it's already got a bunch of magnetite because this chunk that we're in here isn't just full of precious metal. You can see it's got magnetite, precious metal, vanadium magnetite, tenorite. We're going to get all of this stuff here. I need to refill it with drilling fluid and I'm going to need to keep topping it up with time in a bottle. But it essentially just works extremely fast. Now you can see it stopped consuming drilling fluid, and that's good. That essentially tells us that we have exhausted all of the ores in this chunk. So if I just pick this up now, we now have this crate which we can move over to back to our base. So here we go. Now we have a whole bunch of precious metal coming through in our steam oven. So if I chuck 2 stacks in here, we should get 4 stacks of gold dust out from our gold line. So yeah, you can see all the machines are running here. So we're smelting up our precious metal into whatever this makes, gold alloy. It's going through the whole system, and you can see the last reactor's already running, creating us gold dust. And the entire thing just loops around. So if I go back to our applied energetics system, There you go, we can see we already have 16 gold dust. Now if I just chuck this through the steam oven, it should just give us straight gold 1-to-1 ratio. Yeah, so there we go. So now gold is sorted, and we need a lot of gold as we progress through the pack, so that's very nice to have. So now we finally have our gold line set up and we can get gold at a better ratio. The next step is to work towards our refined processors. Now these are the first circuits that I want to be able to craft on demand. And because I'm doing them on demand, I want to have the plastic circuit boards which are required for them passived, which means we need to make sodium persulfate on passive as well, because I don't want to use iron 3 chloride. And in order to do that, we need a couple of things. We need passive sodium dust, and we need passive sulfur to make a bunch of chemicals in the chain. So first things first, in order to get the passive sodium, I want to set up a cobble-works, which is essentially cobble processing on passive. That will allow us to do clay dust electrolysis, which not only gets us passive sodium, but also gets us passive silicon and aluminium, which are useful for things like silicon balls and MV components. Cobble-works will also get us other cobble related items, which will help us build the base, because we use cobble a lot in these X-tones blocks, concrete, all sorts of things like that. And then the other thing that we want to passive is we want to passive sulfur dust, which I'm going to get through crushing blaze rods. So I'm going to passive the blaze rods from a blaze spawner into a vial processor. And because we're passiving the blaze spawner, I feel like we might as well passive the other spawners that we've got as well. So this is going to be quite a rabbit hole that we have to go down before we can get our refined circuits. But I think it will be worth it in the long run, and we'll have some infrastructure set up now in terms of the cobble-works, which will last us a good portion of the game. So I'm going to go ahead and get that started now, and I'm going to start with the spawner passivization, the spawner passive setup. Okay, so these should be set up now. We've got a bit of a problem in terms of energy, because these spawners draw a lot more than we're producing from 2 diesel generators at MV. But that shouldn't be too much of an issue at the moment, because I've got the blaze one as the first on the line, and then skeleton, zombie and enderman, which consumes the most energy last. So essentially it just runs blaze first, which is what we need for sulfur. And we can get the rest of them running just by adding more power once we need them later, essentially. They still run once the blaze one turns off every now and then, and these level emitters here mean that once we reach a certain level, then the other ones are going to turn on anyway. And the outputs are all sent to the storage drawers. Now these 4 things along the bottom here I haven't got void upgrades on, because these are the things that we're level emitting, but these 3 items here I've got void upgrades on, just because these are going to overflow the capacity of these drawers currently, because there are no upgrades on them. But we don't need any of these items in particularly large amounts at the moment, so it's not too much of an issue. So now we can get to work on building the cobble-works. And the things I want to create here are obviously cobblestone, and we're going to process cobblestone into these resources here. So we've got gravel, we've got sand, we've got clay, we've got glass, and we've got clay dust, which obviously comes from clay. And then I'm going to electrolyze this into aluminium, silicon, sodium, all of these things here. So the gravel we just make in a forge hammer from cobblestone, and then we can obviously use the gravel, put it through a crusher or a macerator, sorry, to get sand, and then clay we get from mixing sand and water in a mixer with an integrated circuit at 0, and then glass obviously we get from smelting sand, and clay dust we obviously get from pulverizing clay. So that shouldn't be too hard, and I'm going to run most of this at MV I think, so we're going to start using some more MV machines. So I'm just going to go ahead and get that set up real quick. So there we go, the cobble-works is now all set up. Now, only certain things here are backing up, because, for example, clay is backing up, but we're not getting sand because the clay thing hasn't backed up fully, and it'll need to back up this drawer before we can back up sand. But it will eventually all back up, it's just a relatively slow process. Now, I did invest in some new technology, which I'm sure you just saw, in high voltage, or HV, and that was these diesel generators, just so we didn't need to make like, I think it was 6 or 7 medium voltage generators, and that wasn't particularly expensive. It just used some of that stainless steel that we batch crafted up earlier in the episode. But here we've got everything we need, and these are the outputs that we've got from the clay dust electrolysis here, and the water I'm just outputting into this fluid can, the excess water from this electrolyzer here. But now we've got the cobble-works and the blaze rod set up both on passive, we're ready to work towards our refined circuits. In order to get our first refined processes, we need a few things. We need SMDs, which we've already got, except for the diode, but I don't think we need the diode for the first one. We also need a central processing unit, which we've got, fine tin alloy, which we can get easily enough, just through smelting some tin alloy dust. And then we need good plastic circuit boards. I mean, obviously we need the MV circuit assembler, but that's not too difficult to make. But the thing here is good plastic circuit boards. Now this needs sodium persulfate or iron 3 chloride, and I'm going to go with sodium persulfate. We also need plastic circuit boards and copper foil, but we can deal with them in a second. Now this sodium persulfate, I am going to create a passive setup and store it in our main fluid storage. And the reason for that is because we need this chemical for processing these circuit boards up until I think it's crystal processors. I'm not sure, let me have to take a look. Yeah, all the way up to insane circuit boards we need sodium persulfate. So we'll obviously have to change this infrastructure around and make it more robust at some point. But I think just setting this up into main fluid storage for now is the best way to go. So on screen here, you can see I have the sodium persulfate line. Again, working from right to left, we need to electrolyze our sodium bisulfate dust, which gives us our sodium persulfate, and it also gives us some spare hydrogen, which we'll just put into fluid storage. And to get the sodium bisulfate dust, we need a chemical reactor with sodium formate and sulfuric acid. Now looking in the bottom left here, you can see we make sulfuric acid with hydrogen sulfide and oxygen, which I'll come back to in a second. But to create the sodium formate, we need to mix sodium hydroxide and carbon monoxide, and we get that from 2 different chemical reactors, one mixing sodium dust and water, and one mixing charcoal dust and oxygen. So excluding the oxygen and the water that we need to input, the other inputs are charcoal dust, sodium dust, and hydrogen sulfide. So charcoal dust we can easily enough get just by macerating coal, or charcoal, sorry, which is quite easy. Sodium dust we're producing from our cobble-works. And then hydrogen sulfide, we need sulfur. So for the recipe here for hydrogen sulfide, we just need sulfur and hydrogen, which is relatively easy to make. And in order to get sulfur, we just need to process those blaze rods that we set up earlier. And we need to first macerate the blaze rods into blaze dust, and then electrolyze the blaze dust, and that will give us sulfur. I'm just going to set this up here on the back of our sodium hydroxide loop with a macerator and electrolyzer. And then if we go ahead and wrench the macerator, oh, wrong button. We go ahead and wrench the macerator to output to the electrolyzer and then turn on auto output. Now if we plop an interface down here, which we're going to connect to the terminal, and link these 3 things up here with Ender IO conduits, we want to extract on green on the interface, in which we're going to stock blaze rods. We want to insert on green into this macerator here. We don't need to worry about extracting from this because it's going to input directly into the electrolyzer. And the electrolyzer we're going to extract on brown, and then insert on brown back into the interface. Now when we electrolyze the blaze powder, we don't just get sulfur, we also get dark ashes. So we're going to need to set up a drawer in main storage for dark ashes with a void upgrade on it, which is relatively easy to do. And then we just need to hook this up, and we have our sulfur automatically being produced. So I've gone ahead and I've hooked everything up. I've set up all the drawers and everything up in the main storage room, and I also just added a level emitter down here with a machine controller on the bottom of the machine, just to turn this electrolyzer off when we reach 2000 sulfur dust in the system, so it's not going to overflow. So now we can get on to setting up the sodium persulfate line. I'm going to just put it next to the gold line here, and I've put all of the machines in the order that I want them, so all I need to do now is hook this up to power and place down the 2 interfaces that we need. So we're going to need a normal interface and a fluid interface, like so, and then I just need to hook it all up with cables. And the way I'm going to power this, because I think we need to use, I think it's 11 amps of LV, because this MV machine here uses 4 amps of LV. So I'm going to use 16x tin cable along the back of these machines, like this. And then I'm just going to do a double transformer setup with a single HV diesel generator, just so that we don't have to place and craft up multiple MV ones, because an HV one is actually easier to craft up at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and get that set up, and then we are ready to move on to the next component of our circuits. Right, so that didn't take too long, and we are now producing sodium persulfate, which I'm storing over here in main fluid storage. And as a byproduct, we also get formic acid, which I've set into this tank here, and when it overflows just to go into this trash can. And another byproduct that we get as part of the charcoal recipe is we get tiny piles of ashes, so I've just put a void upgrade on this drawer here to deal with that. But now we have sodium persulfate, we can actually start to craft up our first refined processes. Now, I've mentioned that I wanted to do this on demand, although we're not going to be able to set that up this episode, as this episode's already getting quite long. So I'm just going to batch craft up a couple of these to start with, and then we'll be able to use some of the ones that we crafted this episode to set up the automation during next episode, hopefully. So I'm going to make some good plastic circuit boards, just by hand, which isn't too difficult. Just need some plastic circuit boards and copper foil, and a plastic circuit board is nothing more than polyethylene, copper foil and sulfuric acid. Again, a simple recipe. Both can be done in LV chemical reactors, so it's nothing special. And then we just need a CPU, some soldering alloy, some fine tin alloy wire, and some other SMDs, which we've already got crafted up. So that's our refined processes crafted up. So I've got 40 of them, which isn't a lot, but with the combined electronic processors at tier 1 that we have in the applied logistics system, it should be enough to get us going with some automation next episode. But I do think that this episode's got quite long, so I'm going to call it there, and we're not going to make the rest of the refined processes today, although we probably will get into that very soon, as soon as we need them, maybe even before. So on that note, thank you for watching. Same as last episode, if you think there's anything that I could change, any tips you want to give me, anything you want to see in the series, please do leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoyed the episode, I'd appreciate to leave a like, because it really motivates me to keep doing this. And if you're enjoying the series, please do subscribe. I have been seeing some growth on the channel, considering it's extremely new, and it really is motivating to keep playing this pack. And that was the entire goal at the start that I mentioned in this series, to record, to sort of motivate myself to complete through the pack as much as I could. So that's going to be it for today. Thank you for watching, and